What if you were accused of something you didn't do? What if the system that's supposed to protect you was the very thing that tried to destroy you? Lacey Johnson, a young woman from Brooklyn, faces a shoplifting charge she doesn't deserve. But her brother, Michael, isn't just going to sit back. Can they fight against racial bias and injustice in the courtroom? Find out in this gripping story of truth, power, and family. Watch now on H2 Black Thread. Like, subscribe, and join the fight for justice. The courtroom buzzed with a quiet, almost suffocating energy. Lacey Johnson sat in the defendant's chair, her back rigid, fingers gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles turned white. She was doing everything she could to keep her breathing steady, to keep her emotions under control. But it wasn't easy. Her eyes darted around the room, at the judge, who was looking tired as usual, at the prosecutor, who stood with his usual cocky smile, and at the jurors, who hardly seemed to care. Lacey had never been inside a courtroom before, and everything about it felt wrong. The walls were a sterile, off-white color, and the air had that heavy, stale feeling. The seats were hard, the room was too cold, and everything seemed to echo slightly, even her own heartbeat. It didn't help that she was facing charges she knew she didn't deserve. Shoplifting. Her. Of all people. She wasn't a thief. She had a job, she paid her rent, she kept her head down and did everything she could to avoid trouble. But here she was, in front of a judge, a jury of strangers, and a prosecutor who was already treating her like she was guilty. Lacey's lawyer, on the other hand, was nowhere near prepared for this. She glanced at him briefly, a man she barely knew, who was currently fidgeting with his tie for what had to be the third time in less than 5 minutes. His name was Mr. Daniels, and from the moment he walked into the courtroom, Lacey could tell he wasn't really prepared for the battle he was facing. His face was flushed, his hair slightly disheveled, and every time he looked over at Lacey, there was a look in his eyes that made it clear he wasn't sure he was up for this fight. In contrast, across the room, the prosecutor, Peter Lucas, looked like he had already won. He was tall, well-groomed, his suit crisp and clean. His smile seemed a little too wide, like he enjoyed this kind of thing, enjoyed using his position to make people squirm, and he was making sure to project that confidence in every word he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Lucas began, his voice carrying across the room with ease, "what we have here today is a simple case, a case of theft, a case where the evidence clearly points to the defendant, Miss Lacey Johnson." He paused, letting his words sink in as he scanned the jury, locking eyes with each of them, as if trying to make them feel the weight of the accusation. Lacey could feel her chest tighten. She swallowed, her throat dry. She had to fight the urge to stand up, to scream that they had it all wrong, but she knew better than that. She was just one person, sitting in a room full of people who had already made up their minds about her. All she could do was sit there and hope. "The defendant was caught red-handed," Lucas continued, pointing toward the screen at the front of the room. A grainy security camera footage flickered to life, showing Lacey walking through the aisles of the store. She could see herself on the screen, but the footage was so blurry it was hard to make out any details. It wasn't even clear what she was doing. Was she picking up merchandise? Or was she just walking past it? It could have been anything, but Lucas was making it sound like it was evidence of her guilt. "Miss Johnson," Lucas went on, was seen on security footage walking towards the exit with unpaid merchandise in her hands. She didn't stop to pay. She didn't even try to check out. She simply walked out, and when the security guards confronted her, she refused to cooperate. Lacey's stomach churned as she heard those words. She didn't steal anything. She hadn't even gotten the chance to buy anything yet. She was still shopping, but Lucas was spinning the story in a way that made it sound like she was a hardened criminal caught in the act. "And what does the defendant do when confronted?" Lucas asked, pausing for effect. She acts like nothing is wrong. She tries to walk away. She refuses to show any remorse. Lacey felt the eyes of the jury shift toward her. They weren't even looking at the evidence. They were looking at her, judging her. She didn't know if it was the way she looked or the way she felt, but everything in that moment felt like it was working against her. And then Mr. Daniels stood up. The noise of his shoes against the floor seemed too loud, too sudden in the stillness of the room. He cleared his throat, an awkward sound that made it clear he was out of his depth. He straightened his tie for the fourth time, glanced nervously at Lacey, then turned to face the judge. Your Honor, if I may," he mumbled. The judge didn't even look up. He waved his hand lazily in a gesture of acknowledgement. Mr. Daniels shuffled through his papers, his hands shaking slightly as he flipped through them, looking for something, anything, to use as a defense. But it was obvious he wasn't prepared. His voice was shaky as he tried to speak. We believe there may be some misunderstanding," he began. "The security footage is unclear and, the defendant's actions." He trailed off, fumbling for the right words. Lacey could feel her frustration building, her heart racing as she watched him struggle. A small part of her had hoped that Mr. Daniels would step up, that he would make her case, that he would prove she wasn't guilty of something she hadn't done. But instead, he seemed to be collapsing under the pressure, failing to even present a coherent argument. And that's when Lacey realized she couldn't rely on him. She couldn't rely on anyone but herself. As the prosecutor spoke again, Lacey's thoughts drifted to the situation outside the courtroom. How had everything come to this? She had just been running errands like any other person. But now, she was sitting here, her life being picked apart by people who didn't care to understand. People who saw her as nothing more than a suspect. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her. The jury's eyes were still on her, scrutinizing her every move. She could hear the quiet murmurs from the gallery. She could feel the pressure of being judged, not for who she really was, but for the story that others had decided to tell about her. Lacey swallowed hard, trying to push the fear away, trying to find her strength. She couldn't let herself fall apart now. She had to stand strong for herself, for her family, for the truth. She just had to wait for her moment. Because in that courtroom, everything was about to change. And Lacey was determined to make sure that when the time came, the truth would come out. No matter what. The tension in the courtroom was thick, almost unbearable. Michael Davis sat quietly in the second row, his eyes trained on his sister. His heart ached for Lacey, who looked so small in that big, cold courtroom. He had promised her he'd be there for support, to stand by her side. But as the minutes stretched on, he felt like a helpless observer. He hadn't expected the case to be easy, but he also hadn't expected it to feel this wrong. Michael was 22, younger than Lacey by 5 years, but he'd always taken care of her. Growing up in their tough neighborhood in Brooklyn, they'd learned early on how to survive. But seeing her in that chair, accused of something she didn't do, something so far from the woman he knew her to be, it was tearing him apart. He had been sitting there, arms crossed and eyes narrowed, trying to keep his cool. He knew that showing any emotion, especially anger, wasn't going to help Lacey. But as the prosecutor, Peter Lucas, continued to paint Lacey as a criminal, Michael's anger started to boil over. The prosecutor was up again, pacing in front of the jury, his voice smooth and confident. Michael could see how easily Lucas was weaving his story. It was like he was spinning a web, each word carefully chosen to trap Lacey in it. And Lacey, she was caught in that web, sitting there trying to keep her composure. But Michael knew she was close to breaking. Miss Johnson, Lucas was saying, was caught on security footage leaving the store with unpaid merchandise in her hands. The evidence is clear. He turned to the jury with a smug smile, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. She was given every chance to pay for the items, but instead she chose to steal them. Michael's fists clenched. It was all lies. The footage was so grainy you couldn't even tell what Lacey was holding. There was no way they could prove anything from that. But Lucas didn't care. He was pushing forward with the narrative he had built, one where Lacey was the villain. Michael looked over at Lacey. Her face was pale, her lips pressed together tightly as if she were trying to hold back tears. He could see her fighting to keep it together, but her hands were trembling, her legs bouncing slightly under the table. She was scared. He could feel it in his bones. And then the prosecutor dropped the bomb. And to make matters worse, Lucas continued, a gleam of satisfaction in his voice, this isn't her first brush with the law. She has a history, ladies and gentlemen. She's been cited before for minor traffic violations. That kind of recklessness, breaking the law, disregarding rules, it doesn't just stop at traffic violations. It extends into the actions we see here today. Michael froze. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Traffic violations. Really? Was that all they had? Was this the evidence they were using to destroy his sister's life? It wasn't just unfair. It was downright ridiculous. Lucas's attempt to paint Lacey as a habitual offender based on a few minor infractions was clear manipulation. He was trying to turn a simple case of a misunderstanding into a criminal's pattern of behavior, and Michael saw through it immediately. This wasn't about the facts. This wasn't about justice. This was about something deeper, something insidious. This was about race. It hit him then. He'd seen this before. In their neighborhood, in the way people treated them, in the way people saw black people like him and Lacey. It wasn't just a coincidence that they were targeting his sister like this. It wasn't just a case of a bad apple in the system. It was something more systemic, something that had been built over years of prejudice, of assumptions made based on nothing but skin color. Michael had heard the whispers, seen the looks, experienced it himself. It was the way Lacey had always been treated when she walked into a store, just another black woman assumed to be a criminal. It was the way people followed her around, eyes narrowing whenever she reached for something on a shelf, the way people held their purses tighter when she passed by. He'd felt it too, walking into a room and watching people size him up before he even said a word. And now, here they were. Lacey was being tried not just for a crime she didn't commit, but for being someone they expected to commit it, simply because of who she was. It didn't matter that she had a clean record, that she'd worked hard to get where she was. The only thing that mattered to them was the color of her skin. Michael's jaw tightened. He couldn't sit back any longer. He couldn't just watch as his sister's life was being ripped apart by lies and assumptions. He had to do something. Without thinking, he stood up. The room seemed to go silent, everyone's eyes turning toward him. He hadn't planned on saying anything. He had come here to support Lacey, not to become part of the story. But now, as he looked at the prosecutor, at the jury, at his sister, he knew that if he didn't speak up now, he would regret it for the rest of his life. "Objection," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet of the room. His heart was pounding in his chest, but his words were steady. "That argument is prejudicial and irrelevant to this case." The prosecutor stopped mid-sentence and turned toward him, a look of surprise crossing his face. The judge looked at Michael, his expression hard to read. "You can't use Lacey's past traffic violations to make a point about shoplifting," Michael continued, his voice gaining strength. "It doesn't prove anything. It's just an attempt to paint her as a criminal because of the color of her skin. And I won't sit here and let you get away with it." The room was still. Michael could feel the weight of every gaze in the room on him, but he didn't care. He was done being silent. He was done letting them get away with it. The prosecutor blinked, taken aback. The jury shifted in their seats, and Michael saw a few of them glance at each other. Even the judge, who had been half dozing, sat up straighter, his eyes narrowing as he took in the situation. The prosecutor tried to regain his composure. "Excuse me, Your Honor," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is a court of law, not a classroom. Who do you think you are, standing up and interrupting the proceedings?" But Michael didn't flinch. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, his eyes locked on the prosecutor. He wasn't afraid. "I'm someone who's not going to let you take my sister down with lies and manipulation," he said, his voice steady. "And if you want to keep doing that, you're going to have to deal with me first." The room went dead silent. Michael could hear the blood pounding in his ears. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if the judge would kick him out or if the prosecutor would make some kind of scene. But at that moment, he didn't care, because he knew something had shifted. He had just taken a stand, and now there was no going back. The battle for Lacey's future had just begun, and Michael was ready to fight. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, as if everyone in the room was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Michael stood, still facing the prosecutor, his eyes unwavering. The words he had spoken just moments before still hung in the air, and he knew that now, more than ever, he had to back them up. He had no choice but to take a risk, one that could either make or break the entire case. The prosecutor, Peter Lucas, had been thrown off guard by Michael's unexpected interruption, but he quickly regained his composure. His face twisted into a mask of annoyance, though a flicker of uncertainty still lingered behind his eyes. Lucas was used to being in control, used to having the upper hand in every courtroom he stepped into. But now, in front of him, stood this young man, this black kid in a hoodie, who had just dared to challenge his entire narrative. "You think you can just stand up here and tell me how to do my job?" Lucas scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is a court of law, not some street corner debate. Who are you exactly?" Michael didn't flinch. His heart was pounding in his chest, but his expression remained calm, his posture firm. He knew that in this moment he had to project confidence. He had to show everyone in that room that he wasn't just some kid who had wandered in off the street. He wasn't going to be dismissed like a joke. "I'm someone who's about to show you how this is supposed to go," Michael said coolly. His voice carried through the room, and for a split second, it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. He glanced at Lacey, who was still sitting at the defense table, looking just as shocked as everyone else. Her wide eyes met his, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Michael saw a flicker of hope in her expression. She didn't know what he was about to do, but something in his voice, in the way he stood, told her that this wasn't over. As the courtroom waited in suspense, Michael reached into his jacket pocket. His fingers brushed the familiar shape of the small leather wallet he had carried with him for the past year, ever since he passed the bar exam and became a licensed attorney. It had been a dream of his, a dream he had worked so hard for, and in this moment, he knew he wasn't just fighting for his sister anymore. He was fighting for justice, and he wasn't going to let anyone stand in his way. The courtroom's silence deepened as Michael slowly pulled out a small card. It was laminated, simple, but powerful. As he held it up, the words "licensed attorney" gleamed on the surface, along with his full name and bar registration number. He held it up high for everyone to see, making sure the judge, the prosecutor, and the entire jury had a clear view. "Actually," Michael said, his voice steady and unshaken, "I'm not just here to support my sister. I'm a licensed attorney in this state." The effect of those words was instantaneous. The room seemed to freeze. The murmur of the crowd died down as if someone had pressed a button to mute everything. Michael could feel every eye in the room on him, their gazes heavy with shock and disbelief. The prosecutor's smug expression faltered. For the first time, he seemed unsure of himself. His mouth opened slightly, as if he was about to say something, but no words came out. The judge, who had been paying little attention to Michael until now, blinked in surprise, his brow furrowing. He looked at the bar ID in Michael's hand and then back at the young man standing before him. It was clear that the room, which had previously dismissed Michael as just a bystander, was now forced to acknowledge him as a serious player in this case. "Excuse me," Lucas finally managed to say, his voice sounding almost weak. He straightened up, trying to regain his composure, but the cracks in his confidence were obvious. "You what? You're a lawyer?" Michael didn't hesitate. "Yes, I am. I graduated last year. I passed the bar exam early and I've been practicing ever since." He took a step forward, the weight of the moment settling in. "And right now, I'm taking over my sister's defense, because clearly the way this case has been handled up until now is a joke." For a moment, it seemed like the whole room held its breath. The prosecutor's eyes flicked back and forth, clearly trying to process what had just happened. It was like watching a puzzle fall into place in slow motion. Michael wasn't just some kid. He was a trained attorney, and that changed everything. The smirk that had been plastered on Lucas's face for most of the trial was completely gone. In its place was a look of concern, of doubt. The judge, too, seemed taken aback. He adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, staring at Michael as if trying to figure out whether this was some kind of prank. "You're an attorney?" he asked, his voice more measured now, without the dismissive tone he'd used before. "Yes, Your Honor," Michael said, his voice calm but filled with resolve. "And I'm more than capable of handling this case from here on out. I'd like to formally take over the defense for my sister." There was a long pause. The judge looked down at his papers, obviously trying to gather his thoughts, but Michael could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He had no idea how to proceed with this new development. He had likely never encountered someone in the courtroom who wasn't supposed to be there, someone who had just revealed themselves to be a legitimate attorney, no less. You want to take over her defense?" the judge asked slowly, his voice soft, almost like he was trying to wrap his mind around the words. "Yes, Your Honor," Michael replied confidently. "I'm ready to proceed, and I intend to show the court exactly how this case should be handled, without prejudice, without assumptions, and without baseless accusations." The room was silent, save for the shuffling of papers as the judge processed Michael's request. The prosecutor's face was flushed now, a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. The jury, too, seemed to be processing what had just happened. The initial surprise was giving way to curiosity. They were all starting to realize something. Michael wasn't here to play games. He was serious. The public defender, who had been more of a placeholder than an actual defender, stood up from his seat and looked at Michael with wide eyes. He didn't speak, but it was clear he had no idea what to do. His role in this case had just been rendered completely irrelevant. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of silence, the judge cleared his throat and spoke again. "Mr. Davis," he said, his tone more neutral than before, "this is highly unorthodox. But I suppose you are within your rights as an attorney to represent your sister in this case." Michael gave a short nod, feeling a rush of relief wash over him. He hadn't expected it to be easy, but he'd expected them to at least respect the law. And now, it seemed like they had no choice but to acknowledge that he was exactly who he said he was. The judge looked at the prosecutor. "Mr. Lucas, do you have any objections to Mr. Davis taking over the defense?" Lucas hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "Objections? No," he said, his voice lacking the authority it had earlier. "But I don't understand." Michael didn't let him finish. "I'm here to ensure that the law is followed," he interrupted. "That means my sister will get a fair trial. No more distractions, no more false narratives, just the truth." The judge nodded slowly. "Very well. Proceed, Mr. Davis." As Michael took his seat beside Lacey, he could feel her gaze on him. She was still in shock, her mouth slightly open as if she couldn't believe what had just happened. But in her eyes, Michael saw something he hadn't seen in a long time: hope. For the first time that day, Michael felt a surge of confidence. He wasn't just her brother anymore, he was her lawyer, and he wasn't going to let anyone take her down. The game had changed, and now it was time to fight. The room was still buzzing from Michael's revelation. The sudden shift in the courtroom's dynamic was palpable. Michael had just gone from being a quiet observer to a force in this case, and the weight of that was not lost on anyone. As he sat down beside Lacey, his mind was already working, piecing together his next moves. He wasn't going to waste any more time on the prosecutor's distractions. It was time to get down to the truth. Michael leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his eyes focused on the prosecutor. He could feel the gravity of the moment pressing in on him. This wasn't just a fight for Lacey's freedom anymore. This was about showing the world that justice wasn't something to be taken lightly. He couldn't let Lucas get away with presenting this case as if it was some kind of slam dunk. Michael knew better. And now the jury was about to learn better too. "Your Honor," Michael began, his voice calm and steady, but with an underlying authority that made everyone sit up a little straighter. "I'd like to focus on the evidence in this case, specifically the so-called security footage that's been presented as key evidence." The judge nodded, gesturing for Michael to continue. "Thank you," Michael said. "Let's take a closer look at the footage. It's been presented as irrefutable proof that my client, Lacey Johnson, was attempting to steal from the store. But, as anyone who's worked with security footage can tell you, grainy, low-resolution video is hardly the gold standard when it comes to proving guilt. The footage we've seen is blurry, lacking any clarity about what exactly my client is holding in her hands. We can't even say with certainty what she's doing in the video." Michael turned to the screen, where the footage from the store's security cameras flickered once again. The grainy video showed a figure moving through aisles, picking up items, and walking toward the exit. It was hard to make out anything beyond the general shape of the person. "Let's be clear," Michael continued, his voice growing more assured. "What we see in this footage isn't a theft. It's a woman shopping. She's browsing items in a store, walking towards the register, but she hasn't even crossed the line into the checkout area before security intervenes. She hadn't even had the chance to purchase anything yet." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. The courtroom was silent as everyone processed what he had said. Michael wasn't trying to get them to believe something outlandish. He was simply asking them to look at the facts, or rather, the lack of facts. "Security didn't even let her make it to the register," Michael said, his eyes scanning the jury, trying to gauge their reactions. "So how exactly can we be sure she intended to steal? All we have is assumption, and that is not proof." And as we all know, assumption has no place in a courtroom. The prosecutor, Peter Lucas, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Michael could tell he wasn't ready to give up. He was still trying to play it cool, but the cracks were starting to show. Michael knew that he had to keep pushing, to keep unraveling the case that Lucas had so carefully built. "Mr. Lucas," Michael said, turning to face the prosecutor, "you've presented this footage as your main piece of evidence. But all it shows is a person walking, possibly thinking about buying something and maybe picking something up. But that's not stealing. That's shopping." Lucas opened his mouth, but Michael cut him off before he could say anything. "You can't prove intent just by showing footage of a woman in a store. Intent is something that must be backed up with clear evidence. And right now, we don't have that." Michael's voice was firm, but he knew he couldn't stop there. "The prosecution's case is built on assumptions and prejudice, not facts." The room fell into silence once again. Michael could see the jury exchanging looks, and he could tell they were starting to question the strength of the prosecution's argument. This wasn't what they had expected when they walked into that courtroom, and it wasn't what Michael had expected either. But now, he was on a roll. He wasn't about to let up. Turning his attention to the store's security personnel, Michael called his next witness. He needed to get to the heart of the issue, the treatment of his sister. He could see the security manager, Richard Dawson, sitting nervously at the witness stand. Dawson was an older man, probably in his late 50s, his broad shoulders squared like someone who'd spent years dealing with this type of situation. "Mr. Dawson," Michael began, his voice even but his words laced with a quiet intensity. "How long have you worked in retail security?" 23 years, Dawson replied, his voice steady but betraying a hint of unease. 23 years, Michael echoed. "So, you've been around long enough to know the importance of following protocol, right?" "Yes, of course," Dawson said, his eyes flicking nervously between Michael and the judge. "Great. So, let me ask you," Michael continued, leaning forward slightly. "When you're dealing with a suspected shoplifter, what are your policies? What kind of confirmation do you need before you intervene?" Dawson shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable under the spotlight. "Well, typically we need to see someone take merchandise without paying for it. We need visual confirmation of the theft before we can stop someone." "And in Lacey's case," Michael pressed, "did you see her steal anything?" Dawson hesitated. "No. But, Michael interrupted, "you didn't need to see her steal anything, did you? Because you already decided she was guilty based on something else." Dawson shifted uncomfortably. "I wasn't the one who made that call," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Then what exactly made her suspicious?" Michael asked, his voice low but sharp. "Was it the fact that she was black? Was it the fact that she didn't look like the kind of person who could afford the things she was looking at? What made her suspicious enough to be stopped before she even had the chance to pay for anything?" There was a moment of stunned silence in the room as Michael's words sank in. He had just said what everyone had been thinking but didn't dare to say out loud. And suddenly, the courtroom felt a little smaller, a little tighter. I don't make decisions based on race," Dawson stammered, but Michael could see the cracks in his story. The defensive posture was slipping and the jury was starting to see it. "Really?" Michael said, raising an eyebrow. "Because if Lacey had been a well-dressed white woman, do you think she would have been stopped? Do you think she would have been treated the same way?" Dawson swallowed hard, clearly trapped. I don't know," he muttered, looking down at his hands. "Let's be real," Michael said, his tone colder now. "You didn't stop her because of her behavior. You stopped her because of the way she looked. You assumed she was a thief because of the color of her skin. And that's what this case is really about, isn't it? It's not about shoplifting. It's about racial profiling." The courtroom was silent. Michael could see the jury, their faces tense, processing what had just been said. And he could tell they were starting to realize something. This wasn't just a case about stolen goods. This was a case about something much bigger. The prosecutor tried to regain control of the situation, but Michael wasn't done. He wasn't about to let Dawson off the hook. "How many times have you, Mr. Dawson," Michael said, "walked past someone who looked like they belonged in the store, someone who wasn't followed or questioned? How many times has security let a white customer walk right by without a second thought, even when they were holding items in their hands? And yet, my sister was stopped, before she could even make it to the register, just because she looked out of place. That's not justice. That's bias." The room was still, everyone waiting for the next move. The prosecutor was quiet now, no longer confident. The jury, Michael could feel, was shifting. They were listening. They were beginning to see things in a new light. "Now," Michael said, his voice firm, "let's talk about fairness, because that's what this is really about. Fairness." The courtroom had been transformed. What had started as a tense, seemingly one-sided battle for Lacey's freedom had shifted entirely. Michael Davis had not only taken control of the trial, but had systematically chipped away at the foundation of the prosecutor's case. What Lucas had presented as solid evidence had been reduced to a string of assumptions, contradictions, and outright prejudice. Michael wasn't just fighting for his sister anymore. He was fighting for something far bigger: justice. As the last words of Michael's cross-examination echoed in the courtroom, the tension was almost unbearable. Every eye was on the judge, waiting for him to make his final ruling. The prosecutor, Peter Lucas, had tried to recover from the onslaught, but it was clear to everyone in the room that he was on the defensive. Michael had exposed the weaknesses in his case with surgical precision, questioning the flawed surveillance footage, challenging the questionable motives of the security staff, and laying bare the racial profiling that had been the silent undercurrent of the whole trial. Now, all that was left was the final judgment. Michael sat back in his seat, his body tense but his mind alert, waiting for Judge Harold Wright to speak. Lacey, who had been nervously clutching his hand the entire time, squeezed it tighter as the moments dragged on. Michael looked over at her, offering a reassuring nod, but even he wasn't sure what would happen next. The silence was deafening. The judge finally cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "Mr. Lucas," he said, his voice cold and precise, "I've heard enough." The prosecutor sat straighter, his jaw tightening. "Your Honor, I'm not finished," Judge Wright interrupted, raising his hand for silence. The authority in his voice was undeniable. "I've given this case more than enough time, and after careful consideration I can say without a doubt that the evidence presented here today does not support the charges against the defendant." Michael's heart skipped a beat. He glanced at Lacey, who was looking at the judge with wide, hopeful eyes. He could see the faintest glimmer of belief beginning to form on her face. "Miss Johnson," Judge Wright continued, "there is no solid evidence to convict you of shoplifting. The footage is unclear, and the supposed intent to steal is purely speculative. The actions of the store security, as pointed out by your attorney, were based not on reasonable suspicion but on racial profiling. This entire case was built on assumptions, and that is not a solid foundation for a conviction in this court." Michael's chest swelled with relief. His eyes met Lacey's, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, he saw the tension start to melt from her face. She looked at him, a tear slipping down her cheek, and Michael's heart broke. He had fought so hard and they had won. But the reality of what they had been through, the fear, the injustice, the uncertainty, was all still there. The judge turned to the prosecutor. "Mr. Lucas," he said firmly, "you are aware that the facts do not support the charges. I suggest that you reconsider your stance, and in light of this, I'm dismissing the case against Miss Johnson." There was a long pause, but it felt like an eternity. Lucas, still visibly shaken from the intense cross-examination, opened his mouth as if to protest. But the words never came. He closed it again, unable to argue any further. He simply nodded stiffly, acknowledging defeat. "Case dismissed," Judge Wright said, bringing the gavel down with a sharp crack. The courtroom erupted into a murmur of disbelief and excitement, but Michael barely heard any of it. All he could hear was Lacey's quiet sobs of relief. She had been so strong throughout it all, trying to hold it together, trying to keep hope alive. But now, with the weight of the world suddenly lifted off her shoulders, she couldn't contain the tears. Michael wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. "We did it," he whispered. "You're free. You're going to be okay." For a moment, they just held each other, and Michael allowed himself to feel the rush of emotions that had been building up inside him. They had won. Lacey was free. But more than that, they had stood up to the system and fought back against the racial bias that had been so deeply ingrained in the case against her. As the courtroom began to clear, the reality of the victory settled in. The judge's decision was more than just a win in Lacey's case. It was a win for everyone who had ever been unfairly judged, unfairly targeted, or silenced because of the color of their skin. This was a small victory in a much larger fight against injustice. Lacey and Michael walked out of the courtroom together, their hands tightly clasped. As they stepped into the hallway, Michael could feel the eyes of the spectators who had gathered in the gallery following them out. He could feel the weight of their stares, but it was different now. They weren't looking at him and Lacey as just a victim and a bystander. They were looking at them as people who had fought back, as people who had made a difference. "I can't believe it," Lacey said, her voice trembling with emotion. I thought I was going to lose everything." "You didn't," Michael said, squeezing her hand. "You didn't lose anything. This was never about guilt or innocence. This was about justice. And today we got it." They stepped outside, the bright afternoon sun hitting their faces, but neither of them cared. The weight of the case had been lifted, and they could finally breathe again. But even as they stood there in the midst of the chaos and the crowd, Michael knew the fight wasn't over. There would always be more battles to fight, more injustices to uncover, more people who needed to be heard. Lacey smiled through her tears, looking up at her brother. "You did this," she said softly, her voice filled with awe. "You saved me. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," Michael said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We did this together, and this is just the beginning." As they walked away from the courthouse, side by side, Michael knew that this wasn't just a victory for him or Lacey. This was a victory for everyone who had ever been judged unfairly, for everyone who had ever been silenced. They had stood up, they had fought back, and they had won, and that was worth more than anything else. "Justice doesn't depend on who you are or what you have," Michael said, his voice quiet but resolute. "It depends on the truth, and today the truth won." And with that they walked into the future, ready for whatever came next.